days of fasting, no food, no sleep, Satan whispers lies to take the royal seat. But Jesus stood firm, soldier Satan's deceiving. We must stand fast, how long temptation lasts. Satan's cage tight, tight, remember this too shall pass.
We'll resist the devil, do it like Jesus did. Quote the word of truth, then the fight he will quit. When we stand on his word, the enemies have to flee. The strength of the Lord, how we walk in victory. We can rise up strong like Jesus in the fight. Temptation won't stand if we walk in the light. The devil will flee if we just hold on tight. He said, man, don't live on bread alone. Satan tried to trap him, but he stood on his own. The devil tempted, tried to make him fall, but the words were as strong as his father's call. When the tempter comes, we stand up tall. With the sword of the spirit, we will never crawl. There's power in the word, it's sharper than a knife. If we resist or flee, just choose the way of life. We'll resist the devil, do it like Jesus did. Quote the word of truth, then the fight he will quit. When we stand on his word, the enemy's got to flee. The strength of the Lord, how we walk in victory. We can rise up strong like Jesus in the fight. Temptation won't stand if we walk in the light. The devil will flee if we just hold on tight. So claim your birthright, let the Holy Spirit free. With faith and power, we'll always make him flee. So take the sword of the word, be bold and be wise. With faith as our shield, we'll break through all the lies. Stand in the evil day, temptation's on the rise. We'll resist the devil, do it like Jesus did. Quote the word of truth, in the fight he will quit. When we stand on his word, the enemy's got to flee. The strength of the Lord, how we walk in victory. We can rise up strong like Jesus in the fight. Temptation won't stand if we walk in the light. The devil will flee if we just hold on tight.
Welcome to the Talk Spot. This is Marcus, and today I'm joined by Gary Wayne, and today we're going to talk about mythical creatures and other interesting topics. All right. Well, thank you, Gary, for coming on. What are some things that you've been up to?
Nothing that's really new other than I continue to put out commentaries kind of on a weekly basis. So I finished a series on Isaiah 13 and 14 and the dual prophecies of that, and tying that into Abaddon and into the Abyss and to Azazel, and quite an extensive series on that. I did starting a series that I did last week on the veracity of the giants being part of the Exodus and the Nephilim wars, and giving people more detail on that. So continuing to give more information that's not really in my book that I have used for research over the years, but to give it in more detail. And I also have a conference that I'll be attending in November. I'll be there from November 8th to 11th in Dallas. That's at the Operation Top Secret conference. That information should be out shortly on, and should be a well-attended conference.
Well, hey, Gary, that sounds very exciting. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about fairies and leprechauns and other mythical creatures. I know the last time you came on, you kind of alluded to them at the end of our conversation. So I just figured that I'd ask you more about them today and just ask you to, expand upon that topic a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting subject, and very, very sort of in-depth subject, particularly as you get into it from the polytheist side in terms of the religions and mythologies around the world. So there's a lot of, literature and classics literature and entertainment today that's all based on related topics of all of this that go back into, the time of prehistory. So, if you're talking about fairies, for example, you're talking about 4 different classifications of the fairy mythos, and it's also regarded as a religion as well as the legends and mythologies around it. So, and in that classification, you have the rebellious fairies that come to this world. So they're very much akin to the gods or to the fallen angels in the Bible. And they're opalescent beings. So they're shining, transparent, spirit-like beings. And they create a second class, which are the earthborn fairies, which are also shining, but they're not quite the same. These are the demigods or the Nephilim or the Tuatha-De that people might be familiar with as a Tuatha-De, I should say, that most people are aware of that, or out of Ireland and up into the Norse mythology. They're the same peoples, and into the Scottish mythologies. And then you have the third class, which are the bodiless spirits, or the shades, or the banshee type of demon spirit. And then the third one is very, very interesting, which is more sort of equivalent to what you're talking about, is the elementals. And that is split into 3 categories around the world. And it's interesting that we don't get little people being talked about in the Bible, but we get it everywhere else in the world. And so around the world, there's a constant of basically 3 sort of categories that are out there. So you have the mischievous ones, like the pixies, like the Manoe, like the leprechaun. You have the good-looking ones, and some of them are, depicted, in as like a Tinkerbell type fairy, and in various different sizes of those good-looking ones. And then you have the ugly ones, which are the ones that are like the hobbits, and are like the dwarves, and are like the trolls, and are the gnomes, and very much sort of slides more akin into a lot of the ancient alien mythos in terms of their descriptions and the agendas that they have. And so you get these 3 classifications all around the world: North American Indians, Southeast Asia, all throughout Europe. As I say, on all continents, there's an accounting of these little people. And typically, they have a connection back to certain gods. And so they are a creation of the gods. And depending on which pantheon that you're looking at, it depends on which god sort of created them. Although I do think the pantheons are essentially the same, just different vernacular names around the world. And so these little people, are created, like the Nereids in the Atlantean mythology, for example, would be one example. And there, again, this goes to that concept in the antediluvian world that not only were giants and titans and cyclops and other giant creatures that were created in the ancient world, but you also have these little people that are part of the same sort of mythology. And so the gnomes are a very interesting one because they looked after the knowledge and the genealogies of the ancient ones and guarded certain portals to the other world. And in the fairy mythology, it's filled with portals to different worlds, and they're called shays, just as the Tuatha-De are also called the Shay people. And you also have fairy domens that are all around the world, and these are like mini Stonehenge type structures that are portals to the other world. And domen means portal, so fairy domen, fairy portal. So you have the creation of these things, and there are just so many of them. And what's interesting about that is they absolutely inundate, our literature and current movies and things like that, just as the superheroes do. And that's all because they're related. So what we're talking about in the antediluvian world is either through technology or through gods and angels, and or angels, depending on your perspective as to who they are, either copulating with animals, copulating with people to create these hybrid types of beings, which goes to that essential aspect of what's wrong with creating the Nephilim, because it was a violation against the laws of creation. And this created, with the Nephilim, a immortal spirit in flesh, which was not permitted in the physical world. The immortal spirit belongs only in the heavenly dwelling places, or other dimensions, or in heaven, however you want to look at that. And so this concept of these beings that are being created are absolutely crazy in terms of some of the things that are mentioned in prehistory. Simple things like flying horses. Okay, that maybe isn't that big of a stretch with the Pegasus, but you also have the centaurs, and these are half human, half horse type of being that are created in a cloud somewhere, according to Greek mythology. So again, that's why I say we're not really sure whether or not that's a copulation or that is some sort of DNA manipulation. And you've got even crazier beings that are out there. So it's just almost an unlimited Pandora's box, so to speak, of all of these different types of creations that I think we need to take more seriously than just part of the imagination, because it goes with all of the religions and the legends right around the world. So
when did these entities exist?
Yeah. Typically, when we're talking about these types of beings, it seems to be rather consistent that this is sometime after Eden and sometime before the flood. Now, there may have been some limited types of these things that were happening after the flood, because we do get some of these creatures sort of showing up, either being recreated or somehow surviving the flood in different accounts around the world. But typically they are sort of antediluvian in kind of nature. And I think one of the best examples to match this up from a biblical and from a mythological and other religions around the world perspectives, if we look at Revelation 9, for example. And for people who may not be, who are listening, familiar with Revelation 9, this is when the abyss is opened. And the abyss is the location where the impassioned fallen angels, and perhaps the worst of their creations, and the other unimpassioned, and the worst of the other unimpassioned angels and gods, were locked away for the crimes that they created in that antediluvian period, whereby it corrupted the whole world, not just with violence, but everything's corrupted, from the genomes to the DNAs to everything that's going on. And out of the abyss in Revelation 9, which is an end-time prophecy, you have coming out, being led by Abaddon and Apollyon, which are the same being, which is the leader of these creatures in the abysses. You have these scorpion beings, right? So who are these scorpion beings? And a lot of people like to allegorize that like as their helicopters and fancy sort of technology. And I think in my approach is that I like to define things out of prehistory as it goes to understanding end-time prophecy. So if we look back into prehistory and into Sumerian history, you have a goddess named Tiamat. And she's a mother of a number of crazy-looking beings. And these are like the Hydra, which most people are familiar with, the multi-headed snake. And you have the dragon, and they call a hairy hero. You have the great demon. You have a savage dog. You have a scorpion man. You have other demons, fishmen, bullmen, and they had these really powerful weapons. And Tiamat had created these gods to control and attack, where necessary, the lower gods. So you have the primary gods in prehistory, and then you have the secondary gods. And those secondary gods might be, the gods of Olympus, where you have Zeus, who everybody recognizes, and then in the primary gods would be Kronos, which would be the first sort of 7. And that's kind of, again, one of these constants that are around the world. So Tiamat is Sumerian pantheon, one of these primary gods. And so it's usually to keep the secondary gods in line that the scorpion beings are created. And so they're known in the Epic of Gilgamesh as the Akrab-Bua-Malu or the Gerda-Balu. And here's kind of how they're described in sort of a paraphrasing of it. It is, they are large beings with the head and the torso and the arms of a man or a human, but they had the body of a scorpion. They had the legs of a bird and the feet of the bird, so they would have had claws. They had wings to fly, and they had powerful destructive weaponry that were launched by some sort of bow and arrow type of weaponry, and they stung their prey from their tails that had venom. This is pretty much the exact same description that is described in Revelation 9 that comes out of the abyss with Abaddon and Apollyon. And I have a commentary if people want this, and great pictures of these beings as to what they look like that are on reliefs and etchings and things that are out of the ancient world. Very, very interesting commentary that sort of links all of this together. But again, these were a creation of the gods. And it's a crazy example where you start to look at prehistory, some of the things that are going on, and then you look into prophecy as to what it's saying in the Bible, and you have this crazy connection. And if you take the word scorpion in Hebrew, that goes back to a word that's spelled A-Q-R-A-B, or crab. Just as I mentioned, they were described by the Sumerians as akrab umalu. So it's very much rooted in the same sort of etymology, and the other name was Gerda-Balu. And so these are very, very crazy monsters. And then they were used after Tiamat was slain to protect the gateways to the underworld and to the abyss, and to protect the sun, the great sun temples around the earth from obviously the enemies, whoever they might be, depending on which pantheon that you're talking about. So it's just kind of the tip of the earth, of the iceberg, so to speak, as to what was likely going on in prehistory.
Do these entities still exist today?
Well, a lot of people think that that is the case. I don't think we have much in terms of solid, hard evidence of that. But, you do hear about, the sort of urban legend, so to speak, of the Dogman and things like that. And you've got the Bigfoot, which also has connections back into prehistory as well. And you still got all of these legends of the little people. And what's interesting about the little people, so I'm going to answer your question quickly and then just talk a little bit more about the little people. So I think we don't have much evidence. I think there's a likelihood that some of these creatures did survive. And I don't know which ones, but if I would look towards one that has the most likelihood that we can say is still around today, I would look at the little people, because in that classification that I talked about, that was the gnomes. There's this one classification that has great technology, and the gnomes were the ones who also kept the genealogies of the bloodlines of the Nephilim and the giants, and also kept the records of all the knowledge that they collected in the Antediluvian world, which I think was greater than we have today, because we're not quite in the end time yet. And I base that on Jesus' prophecy of the end time. The days are going to be like Noah, and I obviously take that beyond just the violence and marriage that was going on. I take it on to the whole corruption and what was behind that corruption of the whole earth, which I think is technology. And so they are in fairy legend. I'll talk about a Scottish legend here, although this is the same story that's repeated over around the world. And I do have this in my book if people were to look it up in my book. They have these very advanced flying machines that come through these portals that I was talking about earlier. And they kidnap people for a fortnight or for about 14 days. And they do sexual experiments on them, DNA experiments, and then they return them. And people tend not to have a good memory of it unless it comes out based on hypnosis and meditation and that sort of things. But the witnesses around it always know about the kidnapping and then the return of these people. And so when you look at the description of these fairies that are doing it, they're called, actually in Scotland, the grey neighbours. And again, you have this classification of this gnome that's like a grey. And the description of that grey fairy is the same as a grey alien. And so when I look at some of these alien things, and I know there's a wider variety in the alien mythos than just the greys, but I look at this as kind of a direct connection to, if there are any that are surviving, to answer your question, I would say this would be the best place to start looking because of all of the reports and things that are going on these days in terms of aliens. Again, we don't have any solid evidence, but the world does seem to be moving for good or bad in a direction where you're going to have a revelation of these type of beings, that we're not alone in the universe. Over 50% of the people today believe that the aliens exist. I'm not convinced if this coming out party for the aliens actually happens is we'll actually get the straight story and is necessarily good for humankind. But I think we're going to see something like this come about in terms of, sort of an apex, because everything's building to accepting and meeting and greeting with these galactic beings from around the universe.
Well, it definitely seems like out of all the entities that we've talked about so far, it certainly seems like there's a bigger push to promote the idea of aliens being real and the idea of aliens making themselves known to the world, just very blatantly and just very flamboyantly in front of people, and maybe something like landing on the White House lawn or something like that. But the next thing I wanted to bring up a little bit is the idea of chimeras and human technology that's kind of being developed today that's kind of causing the creation of chimeras. So for example, we've heard about the reports or the stories, and they're not even necessarily even conspiracy reports or stories at all, in that we can clearly see them in labs today where you see mice with human ears on them. At least that's one that I've heard of. There's probably other human limbs that have been grown on animals. But a question that I've always kind of thought with that whole idea is, okay, so let's say, you have a mouse today that can grow a human ear, but let's say, 10 years from now, a monkey could partially grow a human brain. To what point then after that, obviously through the intervention of human technology and laboratory work that can happen. But the question I guess that I have today, or thought, is that at what point can an animal be mixed with human body parts? Does that animal then become a person, if that makes any sense?
Oh, I think it makes perfect sense. And in terms of how it will have a complete redefining as to what humanity would be under those sort of circumstances. And the chimera comes out of Greek mythology, where it was a combination of a large number of beings, similar to sort of the description that these scorpion gods had, except they were more of a lion characteristic, but other significant characteristics mixed in. So the question gets to be is, okay, we're doing that today with the Chimera Project, and it's seemingly heading in the same direction. So is this how so many of these beings were created in prehistory and then a reflection of that technology, or was it actually the gods that did it? We don't know. We do know knowledge came from the gods. We do know that in so many records around, whether it's the Bible or other mythologies and religions, is that they actually did have sex with some humans to create the demigods. But in most of the religions and accountings for the little people, the elementals of the different classifications, they seem to be a byproduct of sexual copulation, but all of them don't necessarily have that same sort of source. So I think this was something that we need to be aware of, because we're on the edge of being able to do all of that and more as our technology and knowledge is advancing at a pace that is just mind-boggling as to how much more knowledge and capability and technology is developing, and at an ever-increasing pace.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like with this technology, one thing that I've thought before about it is that it just seems like it's rapidly evolving so fast that, I mean, for example, if you take a look at, 1000 AD to 1500 AD, it seemed like the technological advances, although there were many, obviously, it didn't seem like they were as drastic as, let's say, 1500 to today, or even, you look back at, 1900 to today. The amount of technological advances that have occurred just seems so drastic that it makes me wonder if that there's been some kind of intervention that have helped people advance so much so fast.
Well, I think so. And just as we had the National Socialist movement, the Nazis of World War II, come out, with incredible advancements quickly. And what they said is they did talk to their pantheon of gods and their spirit guides and their celestial masters as part of the secret societies and the Ariosophy religion that they had, which is a evolution or a perversion, depending on who you talk to, of Theosophy, which is Gnosticism as its creator in terms of that religion, or a branch out religion. And so I see such a ramp up of technology as we continue to move forward that it is like we're getting help with it, because I don't believe it's just the knowledge feeding on itself. It just seems to be, from where we're headed and going with it, is that it's being coached or guided. So if we are approaching the end days, which I think we are, so the listeners understand we're not in it, but we might be able to see it on the horizon. With all of the signs. This is one of those signs that I think Jesus was talking about when he said it was going to be like the days of Noah. And what happened in the days of Noah is the Nephilim were created. And in the days of Noah, you had a merging of two banks of knowledge. You have the 7 sacred sciences, which are being developed throughout the first 6 generations or so of the people of Genesis. And then you have the illicit knowledge from heaven merging with the creation and the timing of the Nephilim with the seven sciences, and extrapolating that for the last 4 generations into a rapid advancement that corrupted the whole world. So I think when we look at that analogy of the days of Noah, I think that's what we're seeing today. And the analogy there it was additional knowledge by the gods or the fallen angels, depending on your perspective, that rapidly expanded this knowledge to create not only the chimeras and the scorpion gods and all these other creatures recorded in prehistory, but also caused the downfall of the antediluvian world, or the first apocalypse by water, just as this is going to be the apocalypse by fire.
Where does this all come out of?
Well, this comes out of, again, polytheism. So this is from the secret societies and the Gnostics. So, and it's recorded in the Polychronicon, and it's recorded in Albert Mackey's History of Freemasonry, and he's a great patriarch of the 1800s of Freemasonry. And so just to give a quick preface on this, and we see this as a related thing as it comes down in all the different legends around the world in just sort of different wording and stuff like that. So as it goes with the Freemasons is Adam was taught the 7 sciences, or the knowledge of God that he wanted Adam to have while he was still in Eden. And then after he leaves Eden and they produce Abel and Cain, Adam teaches this knowledge to both Abel and Cain. Abel's murdered, Cain leaves, and then later Seth is born. And what's important to understand that is there's 2 avenues of these 7 sciences as they're starting to develop. And from the Cain side, he has a son named Enoch, understanding there's 2 Enochs in biblical genealogies. One's the son of Cain and one is the son of Jared. The son of Jared is the one that's taken to heaven. So we want to be careful not to confuse these 2. And they both wrote scripture, as it seems, from various different sources. So when you're reading Enochian literature, you want to be aware of this. So Enoch puts this knowledge into 7 disciplines or sciences that we would know today as the 7 liberal sciences. So they're very much the same sciences that we are aware of today. And, they would be things like, grammar, rhetoric, dialectics, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, with the 5th science being what they call in the craft or Freemasonry, actually called Masonry as the 5th science. And so this is the knowledge that then is developed up to about the 6th generation, where then it partners with the illicit knowledge of the gods and or the fallen angels, as the book of Enoch, first book of Enoch, talks about. And it develops this knowledge to a whole level that just rapidly expands that knowledge. And the knowledge is sort of reflected biblically in what is going on in the Cain lineage. When we look at Jubal being listed as one of Lamech's descendants, and there's 2 Lamechs. Again, I'm still on the Cain lineage here, but there's a Lamech on the Jared lineage, as being responsible for inventing tents and ranching. You have Jubal also, who is credited with promoting Masonry, which is why he's a great patriarch of the Masons. You have Jubal, who's both in the Bible and Freemasonry accredited to creating of music. And you have Tubal-Cain, which most people are aware of. In the Bible, he forged tools in bronze and iron, and is thought to be the patriarch of the Kenites that somehow show up after the flood. And you also have him as the greatest artificer of Freemasonry, who created tools and weapons, and was a master craftsman and a master at military strategy, and as a great warrior, and is thought to be Tubal-Cain in their tradition in Freemasonry records. So again, what we have is a merging of all of these different things in terms of what do secret societies have to do with the end time, particularly when you understand that they take their beginnings, and this is their writings, this is what they say, this is not me necessarily believing it, but taking them from what they say, that their societies were created at the same time as mysticism, the sun-worshipping mysticism, and the giants were being procreated on the earth to protect this knowledge, to bring it down through the mystery schools throughout history.
Is this knowledge in and of itself inherently evil, or is it more neutral? What would you say about that?
Well, knowledge is neutral. Knowledge can be used for good, or it could be used for evil. So it's not the knowledge that you have to worry about. It's what you do with that knowledge. And that's always, the second side of the blade. And typically the knowledge doesn't always get used for good. And so that's the issue. So what's guiding the development of the knowledge? And to what end? And that's where the debate should be on knowledge, not with whether or not knowledge is good or not. And are we ready to, and have the wisdom to, and the discipline to handle the development? And should it develop faster than our ability to do that?
Yeah, it just seems like with technological advances today, even in the fields of genetics, but also, even tech, it just seems like the advances are happening so fast, and I feel like legislators aren't really able to set what are the rules to play by beforehand, and it's more they act in a reactionary way in that they respond to what's happening, but they're not necessarily forward thinking or laying out what to actually do beforehand. So I mean, we see it right now even with the tech world, in that there's talks now about having antitrust legislation brought up against Google or Facebook or things like that, or companies like that. But it's very reactionary. It's not forward thinking. It's okay, well, these tech companies are so big now we have to respond to them. And it seems like the same thing that's going to go on with genetics as well, and these ideas of these chimeras or hybrids or things like that that'll be made in the future, even cloning, where it just seems like all the legislation now is just going to be reactionary, and it's not very like, oh, we should do this beforehand.
Well, developing things as you go is no way to deal with it, because you're developing it after the fact, right? And you never really catch up on it. So we don't know, in terms of these beings that would be created, is will they even have a conscience of any form, right? Will they be absolutely amoral? Or will they be psychopathic? Will it be good? Will they not? I mean, we have no idea, and we have no idea what we want them to do, and we have no idea where we want them to fit into society. But yet we want to jump forward into that until we have had that proper debate and a proper resolution to the definition of what they are, who they are, where they fit, how we're going to manage this. And I just think we're moving so far ahead of our understanding and wisdom at this point that, to me, it becomes frightening, because we have no idea what the consequences are going to be.
No, I think you're completely right, Gary. The next question I kind of want to ask you a little bit about, and you alluded to it again in our last interview, was the idea of dinosaurs, kind of, where they came from a little bit, and the distinction between dinosaurs and dragons. Because I feel like most people in our contemporary world, they view dragons as these mythical entities that breathe fire and have wings and guard caves with gold. And I think most people view dinosaurs as these very real world animals that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. But I just figured that I'd ask you to kind of talk about that a little bit, maybe reconcile the difference between these, dinosaurs and dragons, if you would, a little bit.
Yeah. So, one of the big questions too is when did dinosaurs exist? We have the scientific perspective in terms of their types of datings that take them to be very old. Is that accurate, or is that not accurate? Do they fit in, before the time of the flood and the time of creation as we have in Genesis, or did they exist before that? And then who created them? How were they created? And why do they have this sort of reptilian sort of look? And it's such a deep sort of subject, but I'll briefly do a quick scan over it, is that we don't know from a Christian perspective that the earth is only 6,000 years old. What we do have is that we have a lineage that goes back to Adam. But is Adam even the first creation? Because the Eden account is so diametrically different than the day 6 account, they really can't be the same creation. So do we have a bit of a gap there between day 6 and the creation of Adam after day 6 and into day 7 or day 8. And then you have this idea that is Genesis 1:1-2 translated properly. And I have handouts for this if people want to get a hold of me through my Genesis 6 Conspiracy website and ask for this information or anything that I'm talking about that I have handouts on. I'll email it to you. Is that you can translate Genesis 1:1-2 as two different ways. The standard theology is that, right in Genesis 1 right through Genesis 7 or day 7 is 7 days, however long a day is. And whether it's 1,000 years or not, that doesn't give you enough of a gap to match that up with scientific accounting for. But you can also translate Genesis 1:1-2 after the heavens and the earth are originally created, that it became void. And when you take it back to Hebrew, you can very much make a case for that actually the earth became void. And so if the earth became void and then it was renewed, as it talks about by the Holy Spirit in Psalms 104:30, then you have the accounting for why the Spirit is hovering over the earth as day 1 is about to begin, because this is a renewal of the earth. So then the question would be, when was the earth destroyed? We know then, therefore, if it was destroyed, that it was just renewed starting with day 1. But you have this age where it seems to me it fits better to have the angelic rebellion fit into. This is not constitutional for me from a Christian perspective, but it tends to fit better than trying to squeeze everything into the accountings of day 1 through day 7. And when we look at these rebellious angels, and then we look at the leader of these angels, they're called watchers in Enoch. And these watchers also show up in Daniel 4. So we know that there's a consistency to the language between Enoch and the Bible, even though First Enoch may not be 100% uncorrupted. But when we look at these angels that are showing up in Genesis 6 as the sons of God, these are the seraphim angels. And the seraphim angels show up in Isaiah 6, and they're 6-winged angels. And you take seraphim back to Hebrew, and that's seraph. And seraph means fiery serpent angel, so a reptilian face to it. And what's important to understand about that is as you put wings on this snake-like being, and you have a heavenly dragon. And these are the beings that are thought to have procreated in Genesis 6 to create the Nephilim, which is why you have descriptions of these offspring demigods and kings afterwards looking like serpents, because they look like their procreators. And then you have the Nakash incident in Eden. Nakash is the Hebrew word for serpent. And everybody looks at the serpent as being this creature as we know it as today, as being slimy, crawling on the ground. But before the Eden incident, in terms of causing the fall of humankind by either being avatared or coached by Satan, and I use the Hindu term avatar because it best describes that it's more of a symbiotic relationship between the angelic spirit and the human or the animal, as Satan also entered into Judas in terms of when he betrayed Jesus, as another example of this to bring down the fall of humans. And what's important about this is that this being before the fall is described as the craftiest or most intelligent being that's out there. It walks, it talks, and it deceives Eve, who then brings in Adam on the deception. And so you have this being that is a serpent-like being, also being around at the time of Adam and Eve. And then if you project that in this species, there could be multiple kinds of this type of being. It would not be too hard to understand that you now have a serpent with wings as opposed to just arms. So there could have been several different kinds of these things within the species. And if that's the case, and I know that's speculation, then you have an accounting for this flying dragon. Now, what's interesting about that, it is in the polytheist and legends that was the rebellious angels and Satan, who is also described as a serpent and a dragon, favorite animal of that time, not out of the Bible, but out of other accounts, particularly in the Gnostic religions. And so then we take that back to the dinosaur question, and I'm trying to do bunch of connecting of dots here, so hopefully I'm not losing anybody, and you have all of these reptilian beings. So it was the time before the renewal of the earth, the time when the earth was overrun by these dinosaurs, which were called dragons up to the 1600s, and then changed to dinosaurs as you have the Royal Society and the development of the 7 liberal arts into the modern age of science. Another rabbit hole I won't go into, but deeply connected to what we were talking about earlier on the 7 sacred sciences. So now they're called dinosaurs, but before they were called dragons. And so they're these reptilian beings. And so were these the beings that the seraphim angels created on earth before the rebellion and were destroyed as part of the rebellion, and all taking place between Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, although I do leave possibility that all that could happen between days 1 and 7.
So then, are you suggesting then that there may have been 3 destructions, 2 that have already happened and one's to come, being the first one being the one with the dinosaurs, then the one with the flood, and now we're headed towards the third one with fire in the book of Revelation?
So when you get into Genesis 1, verses between 1 and 2, you get into the words formless and void. So yes, you're talking about a third destruction that we're talking about for end time prophecy. And formless and void come from buhu and tuhu in Hebrew, which is sort of an active verb about becoming that way. And then when you get into Isaiah 45, I mean, God talks about God not creating anything out of vain and to be lived in. So why would he create the world as being void? He would create it all at once because he's omnipotent. So yeah, what I'm laying out is a possibility that you have three destructions, with the third one somewhere down the road. Could be on the horizon, but I don't set dates on making those kinds of predictions.
That's a good point. It seems like to me something that I think about, and I think a lot of other people think about this too, about the dinosaur world, quote unquote, is that it seems so distant and so far removed from the world as we know it today. So, I mean, I think when people think back to the past and they think, okay, you know, a woolly mammoth, I think that they can look at that and say, okay, well, the living descendant of that today is an elephant. Or, you know, the saber-toothed tiger, for example, they look at that and say, okay, the modern day descendant of that is a tiger or a lion. And it seems like because of those bridges that ancient animal doesn't seem so far removed or so alien. But yeah, when you look at dinosaurs, for example, they seem so distant because there's no real world things like it today. I mean, most of the time, you know, we think about, you know, like, you know, dinosaur things like that today. I mean, you're thinking what, like a little lizard or maybe a crocodile or an alligator. But even that, really, I mean, there's nothing similar to the Tyrannosaurus Rex, for example, in regards to, you know, how it looks, how it operates, and things like that, or, you know, the long neck dinosaur. You know, you don't really see any real world examples of that today. So I feel like because of that, it just makes the dinosaur world seem so far away or just so foreign to anything that we experience in this world right now.
Yeah, but there are connections there between those ones and similar type of ones in a dinosaur size, right? That would have been recorded in prehistory, as you mentioned, with the tiger. Same with the crocodiles. So there's some room there, but but from the basis of the point that you're making, I agree with that. It just seems to be like a world away from being part of our shorter term history and you know, or recent history. So it's hard to see how that connections are. And it's also interesting to see how science is now moving towards the idea that most of these, or a lot of these dinosaurs, had feathers as opposed to just being, you know, our typical sort of hard-skinned or slimy reptilian sort of version is what would come to mind for most people. And I find that rather illuminating to the fact that I think that's an important connection to the idea of who the seraphim angels were when we talked about them as, you know, having wings and an opalescent being, and in the physical world as a, you know, six-winged angel. And so they will, presumably, and how we like to depict them is with feathers. And then we have what we call the plume serpents and the I'm trying to think the feathered serpents out of Central America, whether it's through the Incas or through the Quiché Maya or the Aztecs, and even into the thunderbirds into native North American understanding. And you have this idea of this flying serpent reptile, creator gods, as they like to, or at least of civilizations and things, as they like to look at themselves. Through the histories of the legends and the different religions around the world. And one wonders whether or not that's what they had originally created in that first world, if that is actually what happened between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, that they created a world after their own image. You know, we don't get an understanding that the serpent out of Eden and whatever was else involved in terms of, you know, the variety of the species, any of them were saved, but maybe they were. And we get this, again, this alien mythos where you have reptilians as one of the more powerful type of aliens in that mythos. And again, you wonder, was there some that were saved and remained, or were they recreated after the flood again? And if those ones were, then what happened to them? And did those angels go back to, who did that, go to the abyss as well for violating the laws of creation? So you have this sort of reptilian sort of understanding of that in the alien mythos. You have that with the Nakash, and then you have that with the offspring of the angels in Genesis 6, and as they're described around the worlds, or the Nagas out of subcontinent of India, and on and on and on and on, and in all continents around the world, that there was this idea of these serpent people. And then we get a couple of interesting prophecies that show up in the Bible. And the first one begins in Genesis 3:15. And that talks about after Adam and Eve have been banned from Eden for eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that there's a prophecy of what they call the serpent seed, where the offspring of the serpent will be at odds with the offspring of the woman ongoing. And so is that an allegory, or is that an actual type of race? And so the only evidence we get for that race as being ongoing would be coming out of Genesis 6. And again, these serpent-like Nephilim beings also survived the flood because they show up after the flood. So if there is a fulfillment of that as an ongoing war or push between serpent or reptilian beings, that's where you would start to look. And then when you get into Isaiah 14:29, it also talks about the serpent root that is going to produce a cockroach, which is an adder or a venomous type of snake, and the flying serpent, which is a seraphim, and actually goes back to seraph as you take that back to Hebrew. And this is a prophecy of the end time when the Assyrian or the Antichrist is on the scene and is destroying Babylon. And Isaiah 14 is also the accounting of Satan, or Hail El, as it's known in 14:12 of Isaiah, as you take that back to Hebrew. And you have this whole concept of this brewing of this serpent type of reptilian adversary, spiritual through the fallen angel watchers who rebelled, including Satan, who seems to be both seraphim and cherubim, as he's described in Revelation 12, and as a cherubim that walks amongst the fiery stones in Ezekiel 28, which the seraphim do as they're described in Isaiah 6, whereas cherubim are just covering angels over the throne. And so he seems to be that powerful before his fall. And you have that serpent imagery being all wrapped into Isaiah 14 and Isaiah 13, which is part of the same prophecy. We do know he's degraded from Hail El to Satan's status, which is adversary, right? It's a title as opposed to a name and a position, as you define that back into the Hebrew language. And so he is degraded because he is no longer as powerful as he is, and which is why angels like Michael will be able to deal with him in the end time. So I think he is degraded. And does that mean he loses, is degraded to look like a serpent or a dragon, or he had that look as well? It's also being seraphim and cherubim before. So it's hard to know, but what we do know is he is degraded in status to adversary.
Wow, Gary, those are some very interesting topics that you mentioned. And yeah, just even throughout this whole interview today, you've brought up some very interesting topics. And I'd certainly love to have you come back on again, and we could talk about more things in the future. But yeah, I also wanted to thank you for coming on today. I want to thank you for your time. And before we go, would you mind telling us how we can follow you online? How can we read the literature that you're producing, and how can we follow any kind of commentaries that you're producing?
Sure. So, and again, I put out one of these commentaries every week to weekend and a half. So, and they're all very detailed as I get sort of into more of the details and behind it, because it's, there's so much information on this that you can't really get it all out in without losing people. So people who are really wanting to get into the detail, you can follow me on Facebook under Gary Wayne. I have 2 Genesis 6 conspiracy pages there. I also have a Facebook group called Gary Wayne and the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and I post all of my commentaries and many of my interviews into those places as well. So, and you can also, as I do the commentary, I'm linked on my social media into Twitter, so that goes out. My interviews and my commentaries go out on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63. You can also contact me and get a good feel for my book if you're interested at my website, which is the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6 conspiracy.com. And there's an email there, or you can connect through to my Facebook pages and or Twitter pages from there as well, if you want to go that way. And you can email me with questions, or if you want any of these commentaries sent to you, I can give you the Facebook commentary link, or I can give you the Word document. So if there's a subject that I talked about that interested you, I likely have a commentary on that I can send you.
Well, great, Gary. Yeah, and like I said, I mean, we'd love to have you come back on again.
Well, terrific. I'd love to come back.